Okay, ladies, this screencast is going to conclude our Chapter 25 notes, so make sure you have those open, and we're going to start by talking about the arms race that developed between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So, as you know already, the term arms race refers to the struggle to gain weapons superiority, and it's a scary time in the world during the era of the Cold War because of the intensity of the weapons that will be developed and the danger of the weapons. Obviously, we kind of began this by constructing the first functional A-bomb that we dropped in Japan. So we're going to see it kind of go back and forth between the Soviet Union and the US in terms of who could build an even better weapon. So after discovering that the Soviet Union was able to successfully build their own atomic bomb, the United States decided to try to build an even stronger nuclear weapon known as the H-bomb, or the hydrogen bomb. The H-bomb would be 67 times more powerful than the atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And the United States was able to successfully test the new H-bomb on the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, which we didn't test it on like a civilization in terms of where people were living, just an island that we were kind of controlling at the time. So we do have a functioning H-bomb by the mid-1950s. Many scientists kind of disagreed with creating such a weapon of mass destruction, especially just after seeing how destructive the A-bomb was, as this is even more powerful than that. The Soviets will respond. Oh, sorry, this is just some pictures of the dropping of the H-bomb. So the Soviets will respond by creating a weapon of their own, called an ICBM, which stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. ICBMs were missiles that could travel at greater distances than previous weapons and hit a pinpointed target with like great accuracy. And so they could like kind of launch a missile off of a ship from like a far distance and have the goal of like landing on a certain point. So that just makes us a little more on edge if any, weapons could potentially reach us, or any of the areas that we're trying to help in Europe. So these are just two examples of how we're building stronger, more intense weapons between the two countries. And this just creates a very dangerous and tense environment. Arms race does have the tendency of just creating more tension and conflict between the countries. This will also lead to the fear that we were not out of harm's way. And so one thing that's going to happen in a lot of the schools is they're going to begin doing basically bomb drills where they are educating children on what to do if sirens were to alert the country of an impending like bombing or attack on U.S. soil. And we call these duck and cover drills. The Civil Defense Agency had basically created a video instructing children how to duck and cover, like Bert the Turtle. And so instead of like tornado drills or lockdown drills like we have today, they did duck and cover drills, bombing drills. A lot of bombing shelters were created at schools to try to just get kids prepared in the event that the United States would be attacked, which just kind of shows y'all that they are expecting that it is a potential, happening, that it could actually happen on U.S. soil, which is rare. I don't think we feel this today in 2019. I will say we're going to talk more about this in class on Tuesday because I have a video to share with you at that time. I want to now just transition to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is going to kind of be the last little, Cuban Missile Crisis and then the Berlin Wall, which is just kind of the last notes of this Cold War unit. Two big events that kind of just also continue to highlight our relationship and dealings with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So, as many of you may know, at some point during the Cold War, in the late 50s, early 60s, the island of Cuba actually turned communist. Okay, Fidel Castro was a communist revolutionary living in Cuba, and he was able to overthrow the weak government in Cuba and kind of rid Cuba of American influence and turn the whole island communist. This is very scary for the United States, as Cuba is a very close island to U.S. soil. It's just south of Florida. Okay, now the country that's super happy about this new development in Cuba is the Soviet Union, because they have a country who is also communist like them, very, very close to American soil. And so the new leader of the Soviet Union, who is Nikita Khrushchev, I have his last name spelled for you on the screen. He's pictured on the screen as well, Khrushchev. Okay, he is the leader that replaces Joseph Stalin, and he is going to quickly ally with Castro and the island of Cuba. He promised to defend Cuba from any potential threat, including from the United States, and he promised to defend Cuba even with Soviet arms. So the Soviet Union actually began to send nuclear weapons into Cuba. And that makes the United States extremely nervous, just because of the potential threat this poses to our own country. There's nuclear weapons that are Soviet weapons very close to U.S. soil. The president at the time is John F. Kennedy. We will talk about him more just in other chapters as well, but in this case we're talking about him kind of through the eyes of the Cold War. Kennedy made it clear that America would not tolerate any sort of offensive nuclear threat from the Soviet Union, and that we would not tolerate increased number of nuclear weapons in Cuba. So in late 1962, basically photographers take photo evidence flying overhead of Cuba, basically realizing that there are Soviet missile bases in Cuba, and some missiles are aimed and ready to launch, pointed at the United States. Some could reach the United States in a matter of minutes, because again, ICBMs allow a great accuracy. Kennedy did let the country know that we had this knowledge, and he made it clear to Cuba and the Soviet Union that we would take any kind of attack as a threat, and we would essentially launch all-out war on the Soviet Union if they were ever to launch one of their missiles at the United States. We then learn that there are more Soviet ships headed towards Cuba with more nuclear weapons on board. And so Kennedy must act, and any sort of attack of these Soviet ships would be an act of war. He doesn't want to come off that aggressively. So he decides instead to engage in a blockade where the U.S. Navy basically quarantined and completely blockaded Cuba to prevent the Soviet ships from being able to come within so many miles of any Cuban port. So we have Cuba totally cut off from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union cannot access Cuba. It's kind of a stand down. But Soviet ships stop to avoid confrontation, and we're basically just staring each other down for several days. It's a very intense moment in the Cold War, and probably the most intense in terms of, fighting could have, broken out at this exact moment. A few days later, Khrushchev does offer to remove all the missiles from Cuba and kind of back off if we agreed to not invade Cuba and threaten Cuban, communism. And we also had to agree to remove some missiles that we personally had put in Turkey, which is kind of a side note, but Turkey is, close to the Soviet Union, so we were kind of guilty of doing the same thing, but in Eastern Europe. So the crisis does end, and the world kind of breathes again, because for a minute there it looked really, really intense that fighting between the U.S. and the Soviet Union would actually break out. The last event of this chapter is just a quick note on the Berlin Wall. So obviously y'all know, Germany had been divided into zones. By this point, it's really just West and East, as the three allied countries that were helping to rebuild Western Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States had kind of left their mark and removed themselves from the equation. We're still influencing them, but they're running their own, Western democratic country. But the Soviet Union has not let go and relinquished control of East Germany or East Berlin. So within the city of Berlin specifically, you very much have a Western democratic Berlin and an Eastern communist Berlin. And just, it's been a decade since the airlift, and there are just large numbers of Eastern Germans fleeing into West Berlin to escape, like, the communist rule of Eastern Berlin and Eastern Germany. And this is kind of a big deal because the more that, more of the Eastern Germans that are leaving, like, the weaker it makes the communist government of East Germany look. It weakens their economy and it makes the government look weak and like a failure. So in order to prevent this like mass exodus, Khrushchev intervenes and initiates the building of a wall dividing East and West Berlin. Not to keep anyone out, but to keep the East Berliners in East Berlin. Basically, the wall's purpose is to prevent any, Eastern German exile from fleeing into West Berlin. And the wall does greatly reduce the amount of people fleeing East Germany, but the wall does become also an ugly symbol of communist oppression, kind of restricting, free travel. And so for decades, families are separated and it is not free traveling for East Germans and East Berliners across the wall. And the reason you may have seen in the museum in DC the big chunk of the Berlin Wall, half the wall one side completely graffitied and painted over as like artistic expression, the other side completely pristine, not touched at all. The clean, meddled with side is the east side because you couldn't get close enough to the wall to touch it or spray paint it. Whereas the West Berliners, who viewed the wall as oppressive, they are the ones that made their artistic mark on the wall. So it's kind of cool, and you can see that difference in this picture on the screen. Please write down any questions you have, and we will watch some videos in class tomorrow and go over this as well. I hope you'll have a good day.